The fact
Look,
is,
I've
a lot
said
of
right
people,
from the beginning that I'm an evil capitalist. I don't make any bones about it. I'm not ashamed of making money. It's very hard to make money.
Can I ask you bluntly how much you make?
I make $80,000 a month on Patreon. My book is selling about 20,000 copies a week. I have royalties that probably amount to something approximating $1.50 on each of those. The tours garner about $35,000 to $50,000 an evening. I have a business that's generating, I don't know, something in the neighborhood of $200,000 a month for me personally. There's some other smaller sources of income than that.
Then you are making a lot of money.
Yes.
Out of this.
I certainly am. And so are a lot of other people.
I mean, why do smart people make more money? Well, they get to where the edge of production is faster. So if you have 1,000 people and you rank order them by IQ, the smart people are going to come up with the new ideas first. And they're going to have more ideas. And they're going to strategize better.
I'm prone to say yes to virtually everything. And so, because if something comes along and I'm interested in it, then I'll want to pursue it. That's a consequence of...
And do you feel stressed up, or is it...
Well, if I'm on top of things, it's great, because it's a never-ending vista of opportunity. But if my mood tilts, then I have way too many things to do, and I'm sort of crushed under the weight of it. So that can be a disadvantage. And then it keeps me... I don't know, it's the downside of having an entrepreneurial temperament. You know, people think that creativity is an untrammeled benefit, but it's not, because it tangles you up in things, and those things can fail. And even if they don't, you have to keep them going once you're committed to them. And so I suppose I have a proclivity to be overcommitted. Now, I've been able to deal with that because I also play a game constantly with myself, which is I'm always trying to figure out how to do things in the maximally efficient manner. And so I can usually figure out how to do multiple things simultaneously in a way that addresses all of them.
Can you give some example?
I'm recording all my lectures, and I'm using them as the first draft for much of what I'm writing. And I do a different lecture every night, so that I'm using the lectures as the grounds for much of what I'm going to be writing next. And so that way and for blog posting, and potentially for newspaper articles, and
for the book as well.
Yeah, and for the book, yeah. And so I built this system called the self-authoring. It's on selfauthoring.com, and it's a series of exercises that are designed to help people write an autobiography and to assess their personality, faults and virtues, and to make a plan for the future. And it really works quite well. We've done a fair bit of empirical research validating it. And that forced me, I built a business out of that, and that forced me to learn how to do sales and marketing and customer support, and to learn to not program software, because I can't program, unfortunately, which is another weakness, but to design it. And so that's another example of efficiency, I would say.
I've always thought that the hard people to explain are the people who are hyperachievers. You know, the ones who are way out on the Pareto distribution. And there aren't very many of them, and they're usually men. You know, so if you look at the median number of publications, for example, that a female academic makes and a male academic, they're pretty much the same. But the mean for men is higher, and that's all driven by a small subset of men who are way the hell out in the Pareto distribution. Now you might ask, well, why is that? Well, it's simple. If you want to be way out on the Pareto distribution, so you're in the top, say, 1% of performers, or even 1/10 of 1% of performers, what do you have to do? Well, first, having an IQ of like 145 or above, that's really helpful. Then you should be insanely industrious. So maybe you'll work 90 hours a week, or 100 hours a week, at nothing but your stupid occupation. And maybe you'll do that for like 50 years. And so if you do that, well, you're going to be in that top 1 in 1,000 category. Well, the issue isn't why there are so few women in that category. The issue is, why are there any men at all in that category? Right? Because it's an insane lifestyle in many ways. You know, it means that there isn't much left there for the rest of your life. You're hyper-concentrating on a single thing. Now, why would men do that? Well, here's a hypothesis. One of the things that drives the probability that a woman will find a man attractive enough to sleep with is his status. So then you can think, well, that's an extra motivational boost for men. Now, whether that's a conscious motivational boost or not is not the point. The question is it a boost that might have been instantiated as an evolutionary element of general motivation? Well, men are more competitive, they're more disagreeable, and if they're more disagreeable and more competitive, they seem to do better, especially in high-status jobs, and then women are more likely to pick men like that for sexual partners, so at some point it becomes difficult to avoid the conclusion, especially since we know that the men on the way out on the tail end of the Pareto distribution are disproportionately likely to sleep with many women. So Warren Beatty, I think, 15,000? That was his estimate. 15,000 women. And Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the basketball player, he figured 10,000. So for every one guy who's got those numbers racked up, that's 10,000 guys who don't. So the male success distribution is extreme, and it's associated with outlier success in some important dimension of socioeconomic success, and then female reproductive opportunity is not, until if it gets so intense that there's no possibility for status, then the whole bloody society is going to flip over, because the guys at the bottom, who are like all the guys, are going to decide that this is a stupid game, and they'd rather flip the board over and, you know, set the markers to 0 and see how they come up in the new society. So it's possible that one of the things that motivates revolutions in human society is excessive inequality, and the reason that that's a problem is because it's so tightly linked to male reproductive opportunity. So there's this idea in Jungian psychology called the circumambulation, and Jung had this idea that you had a potential future self, which would be in potential everything that you could be, and that it manifests itself moment to moment in your present life by making you interested in things. And the things that you're interested in are the things that would guide you along the path that would lead you to maximal development. Now, it sounds like a metaphysical idea or a mystical idea even, but it's not. It's not. It's a really profoundly biological idea. The idea is something like, well, you're set up so that you're automatically interested in those things that would fully expand you as a well-adapted creature. Well, like, there's nothing radical about that idea. What else could possibly be the case? Unless there's something fundamentally flawed about you, that is what the situation would be. It's kind of interesting to think about how that would be manifest moment to moment, but the idea is something like, well, your interest is captured by those things that lead you down the path of development. Well, that better be the case. Okay, so that's fine. And so there's some utility in pursuing those things that you're interested in. That's the call to adventure, let's say. So, and the call to adventure takes you all sorts of places. Now, the problem with the call to adventure is, like, what the hell do you know? You might be interested in things that are kind of warped and bent. And often it's the case that when new parts of people manifest themselves and grip their interests, say, they do it very badly and shoddily. And so you stumble around like an idiot when you try to do something new. That's why the fool is the precursor to the savior from the symbolic perspectives, because you have to be a fool before you can be a master. And if you're not willing to be a fool, then you can't be a master. So you're going to, it's an error-ridden process. And that's also laid out in the Old Testament stories, because the first thing that happens to all these patriarchal figures when God kicks them out of their father's house when they're like 84 is that they run into all sorts of trouble, and some of it's social, and some of it's natural, and some of it's a consequence of their own moral inadequacy. So they're fools. But the thing that's so interesting is that despite the fact that they're fools, they're still supposed to go on the adventure, and that they're capable of learning enough as a consequence of moving forward on the adventure so that they straighten themselves out across time. And so it's something like this. So this circumambulation that Jung talked about was this continual, we'll return to this continual circling in some sense of who you could be. You might notice, for example, that there are themes in your life. You know, when you go back across your experiences, you see you kind of have your typical experience that sort of repeats itself. And there might be variation on it, like a musical theme, but it's like you're circling yourself and getting closer to yourself as you move across time. That's the circumambulation. Now, you remember that for a sec, because we'll go back to it. Okay, so imagine that something glimmers before you. It's an interest that's dawning, and you decide, well, first of all, you're paralyzed. You think, well, how do I know if I should pursue that? It's probably a stupid idea. And the proper response to that is, you're right, it probably is a stupid idea, because almost all ideas are stupid. And so the probability that as you move forward on your adventure that you're going to get it right the first time is 0. It's just not going to happen. And so then you might think, well, maybe I'll just wait around until I get the right idea, and which people do, right? So they're like 40-year-old, 13-year-olds, which is not a good idea. And so they wait around until it's waiting for Godot, until they finally got it right. But the problem is you're too stupid to know when you've got it right. So waiting around isn't going to help, because even if the perfect opportunity manifested itself to you in your incomplete form, the probability that you would recognize it as the perfect opportunity is 0. You might even think it's the worst possible idea that you've ever heard of anywhere. Highly likely. Highly likely. So you have, Nietzsche called that a will to stupidity, which I really liked. So, because he thought of stupidity as being you have to take it into account fundamentally and work with it. And so you can take these tentative steps on your pathway to destiny, and you can assume that you're going to do it badly. And that's really useful, because you don't have to beat yourself up. It's pretty easy to do it badly. But the thing is, it's way better to do it badly than not to do it at all. And that's the continual message that echoes through these historical stories in Genesis. It's like, these are flawed people. They should have got the hell out of their house way before they did. And they go out and they stumble around in tyranny and famine and self-betrayal and violence. But it's a hell of a lot better than just rotting away at home. And that's great. So that's good. And so why is that? Well, okay, so you start your path and you think that you're heading, towards your star. And so you go in that direction. And then, because you're here, the world looks a particular way, but then when you move here, the world looks different, and you're different as a consequence of having made that voyage. And so what that means is that now that thing that glimmers in front of you is going to have shifted its location, because you weren't very good at specifying it to begin with, and now that you're a little sharper and more focused than you were, it's going to reveal itself with more accuracy to you. And so then you have to take it's almost like a 180-degree reversal. But it isn't, because, you've gone this far, and that's a long ways to get that far. But that's a lot farther than you would be if you just stayed where you were, waiting. And so it doesn't matter that you overshoot continually, because as you overshoot, even if you don't learn what you should have done, you're going to continually learn what you shouldn't keep doing. And if you learn enough about what you shouldn't keep doing, then that's tantamount at some point to learning at the same time what you should be doing. So it's okay. So it's like this. Now, what's cool about it, though, I think, is that as you progress, the degree of overshooting starts to decline, right? And that we know that there's nothing hypothetical about that. As you learn a new skill, like even to play a song on the piano, for example, you overshoot madly. You're making all sorts of mistakes to begin with, and then the mistakes, they disappear, because it's punctuated by intermittent deserts, essentially, by intermittent catastrophes. And if you don't know that, well, then you're basically screwed, because you go ahead on your movement forward and you collapse and you think, well, that didn't work, I collapsed. It's like, no, that's par for the course. It's not indication that you failed, it's just indication that it's really hard. And that when you learn something, you also unlearn something. And the thing you unlearned is probably useful, and unlearning it actually is painful. So anyways, the fact that you're full of faults doesn't mean you have to stop. And thank God for that. That's a really useful thing. And the fact that you're full of faults doesn't mean that you can't learn. And so you can posit an ideal, and you're going to be wrong about it, but it doesn't matter, because what you're right about is positing the ideal and moving towards it. If the actual ideal isn't conceptualized perfectly, well, first, surprise, surprise, because like, what are you going to do that's perfect? So it doesn't matter that it's imperfect. It just matters that you do it and that you move forward. So that's really positive news as far as I'm concerned, because you can actually do that, right? You can do it badly. Anyone can do that. So that's useful. If you're accustomed to keeping things in the fog in general, you're going to keep yourself in the fog with regards to your investments, because in some sense everything you do is an investment, right? I mean, some of it's quantified in monetary terms, but you're always investing in one manner or another. And so I think if your character has been disrupted by your persistent attempts to deceive yourself about the nature of reality, you're going to be a financial train wreck. And I mean, I've certainly seen that in my clinical practice. I've seen people burn through amounts of money that you wouldn't think someone could burn through in that short a period of time because of self-deceptive blindness. If you have a high IQ and you're conscientious, which is another trait, then you're more likely to be financially successful, say, by the time you're in middle age. And so that looks like two temperamental traits whose presence enables you to beat randomness over time. So those traits work very well in this society at this time, but you can also argue that that's also a matter of chance, because there wouldn't be unconscientious people if at some point in the past unconscientiousness hadn't aided their survival. So what constitutes beating a system depends on the parameters that you put around the system. And you can think the same thing about, well, look at how successful he is. Okay, you mean financially. All right, so then, well, how's his health? How's his marriage? How are his relationships with his children? What price did he pay for his wealth? Like as you add dimensions of evaluation, whether that particular person won or lost might not be so self-evident. Well, they gamble partly because it's fun. And I mean that technically. Most of the neurochemicals that your brain produces that are associated with the kind of pleasure that people really like, which is like, for example, the kind of pleasure that drugs like cocaine produce, are produced by risky behavior that has the potential for high return. We like that sort of thing. And people are wired so that they're more responsive to the probability of something good happening than even to the good thing. So, for example, we know that if people win the lottery, a year later they're about the same as they were. No better, no worse. So, actually winning all that money has a limited long-term impact on their happiness. That's probably more determined by their trait temperament. But the lead up to the good event, that's the exciting part. It might happen, it might happen. That's excitement. And that's produced by, like gambling will produce that, especially for some people, because some people are really susceptible to that kind of reward. Everyone's susceptible to it to some degree, and that can be manipulated, and that's what slot machines do. Like slot machines manipulate the human propensity to engage in a certain kind of gambling behavior. And why do people gamble? Sometimes taking a risk really pays off. And not taking a risk is also a risk. So there's no way out of risk. It's gamble one way or another. Just like a lottery ticket winner. What are they paying for? They're paying for the fun that's associated with the anticipation of the reward. And the brain, your emotional brain isn't that great at calculating mathematical probabilities. And so it sort of says, some chance. You have some chance of winning $50 million. Well, it might be 1 in 380 million, but your anticipation system isn't a mathematical system. It just says, well, you have some chance. That's a lot more than none. Well, in some ways, it's infinitely more than none, because at zero, you have no chance, and, with one ticket, you have some chance. So that gets the old excitement going. You can say a life without risk is hardly worth having. You know, it might be secure, although it isn't, because as I said, not taking a risk also constitutes a risk. And you know, when you look back, people often are more upset about the things they didn't do, the chances they didn't take, than the failures that they encountered. Now, not always, obviously, it depends on the failure. But, you know, you can sit at home encased in styrofoam and have your meals delivered. And you're probably, you know, you're not going to get mugged, probably. But what's a hell of a life? Men are more aggressive. Men have more testosterone than women. And men are more aggressive than women. And along with that aggression comes a greater propensity to take risks. And so you see this, the best example of that, really the best example is, and the best proof of it is the fact that there are way more male criminals than female criminals. Like, way more. And usually if you get a female criminal, you know, she's tangled up with some guy that dragged her along. I mean, not always, obviously, but it's like 10 to 1. So, yeah, men take more risks. There are more great successes among men and more catastrophic failures. And that's the case in most of the sexually active animal kingdom. Men are relatively more expendable. So here's an example. More than twice as many of your ancestors are female than male. Because on average, almost every woman has one child. Whereas many, many men have none, and some have a lot, like really a lot. I think they estimate that Genghis Khan's genes are present in something like 30% of the Asian population. So there's massive mating success differential among men. And that also inclines them to take risks, because you can be fantastically successful genetically as a male, although you can fail absolutely, whereas with a woman can be moderately successful. So, you know, people have tried to define what constitutes optimal health or optimal performance in a system or a person in a bunch of different ways. You can say, well, deviation from the average is pathological, but we don't think about that with talent or beauty or intelligence. So as a general principle, that can't be right. Some people have said for mental health that a system is unhealthy when it deviates from its evolutionary function. Well, I don't buy that, because it's very difficult to specify the evolutionary function of all sorts of things. So that just doesn't solve the problem for me. What seems to happen, as far as I can tell, is that things are useful up to a certain point, and once they dominate, and sort of like the Cyclops image, with the Cyclops only seeing one thing. If you get too single-minded about anything, any virtue, or any behavior for that matter, it hits a point where it starts to turn back on itself, and then you've gone too far. And when it turns back on itself, it hits what's technically called a positive feedback loop, and then the thing spirals out of control catastrophically and unpredictably. And I can give you some examples of that. So let's say you start to get depressed. Okay, and you know, maybe you're slowly getting more and more depressed. Well, there's going to be a tipping point, or there often is a tipping point, where you're so depressed, you quit going to work and you lose your job. Well, that's not so good for your depression, because now you're not only depressed, you're unemployed, and you don't have any money. Well, and then maybe, you know, your wife is getting pretty tired of having to deal with you because you're depressed, and now you also don't have a job, and the stress is too much for her, and so you fight a lot, and that makes you more depressed. And then you start to stay at home because you don't really want to show your face in public, so you lose all your friends, and man, it's a cliff. So you're doing not too bad, even though it might be a downhill walk, until you hit this like single event, and then it just goes whomp. You know, because being unemployed makes you more depressed, and that makes it less likely that you're going to look for a job. And you can, okay, with alcoholism, and other forms of addiction, what seems to happen to me is that you hit the positive feedback loop point when you start using the drug to cure its own withdrawal symptoms. So you're not in trouble with cocaine until you start using it because the cocaine has made you feel bad in the withdrawal. Same with alcohol. You're all shaky and you got the shakes and so on, and you figure out one day, Jesus, shot of vodka, I'm good. Yeah. No. You're firmly in the grip of the devil at that point. And I think a lot of systems are like this. They work fine, but as they get more and more exaggerated, they get closer and closer to a tip-off point, and then the tip-off point is where all hell breaks loose. And virtues are even like that. So we know, for example, that conscientiousness is a trait, and conscientious people are industrious, and orderly. So it's like the Protestant work ethic. Okay. We also know that orderliness is grounded in disgust sensitivity. Okay. We know that orderly people on average have better hygienic habits and they live longer. But they're also more inclined to radically disapprove of homosexual behavior. They're also more anti-foreigner because they have a real tight me, not me discrimination system, and they're disgusted by what's not me. Well, that's good. You don't like dirt. And you can be sure that among our forefathers, it was very frequent if you were an explorer and you went out to meet a bunch of strangers, you and your whole damn crew were dead 3 weeks later because they gave you some disease you have no resistance to whatsoever, and it just wiped you out. I mean, that's what happened to the Native Americans. And it wiped out 95% of them. You know, this is a deadly thing. Anyways, as orderliness increases in its intensity, it starts to shade into like vicious intolerance. So the fascists, for example, the Nazis, were orderly. They didn't like parasites. And they thought of anything that wasn't just like them, their corporate body, the Aryans, was a parasite and it should be eradicated. That's a pretty good idea when you're eradicating parasites. I mean, Hitler tried to get rid of tuberculosis to begin with. But then the question arises, what's a parasite? At some point, it's like everyone who isn't me. And, you know, Hitler got to that point before he died because he felt that the whole German society, he lost faith in the Aryan society as the war was being lost. And he was perfectly happy that the bloody place went up in fire, which is a purifying element. So, you know, even, look, conscientiousness is virtuous. But you take any virtue too far, off the cliff you fall. So there's like this range within which something works. And when you push it past that range, it starts to feed on itself and it turns into some variant of hell. So enthusiasm can easily get out of control. That's what happens when a party gets out of control. That's what happens. Enthusiasm makes people impulsive. It makes them discount the future because today is so great. Enthusiasm turns into mania. And so, you know, everybody says, well, you should be happy. You should be feeling positive affect all the time. It's like, no, wrong. Positive affect is dangerous. You're always telling your kids to stop being so happy. You don't notice it, but they're running around causing trouble. They're having a wild time. They're throwing their arms in the air and they're laughing and they're running around. They're having fun. You say, hey, quiet down. And if you count your disciplinary actions, you'd be shocked at how often what you're doing is telling your children to stop having so much fun. It's disruptive. And you know what happens too if you let your kids have fun out of control? Sooner or later, one of them bangs their head on a table or falls down the stairs or gives another kid a poke or, you know, like it will, or breaks something or, you know, it isn't just that it bothers people. It's that it's the Dionysian danger. It's orgiastic danger. You get too enthusiastic about things, you get into trouble. It's not negative emotion that drives teenage pregnancy. It's impulsive positive emotion. Right. The problem is, and this actually speaks to what people are like, benefit is finite and risk is infinite. You can die. You can only be so happy. You know, like you can be really happy. Yeah. You can be like just 100% dead. And you're actually kind of wired that way because people are more sensitive to negative events than to positive events. So a loss will hurt you more than a gain of the same magnitude will please you. So the reason I'm saying that is because it shows you that we're actually set up for a risky world. Our nervous systems are tuned to be more sensitive to negative information because the world's so damn risky. Now, we'd be completely hiding like a nocturnal animal, except that, you know, we figured out ways to make risk valuable. So we're ambivalent creatures. You know, we're thrilled by opportunity and terrified by it at the same time, which is exactly how it should be. Risk is everywhere. That's the first truth of Buddhism, right? Suffering is inevitable. Life is suffering. Same thing. Risk is everywhere. Life is suffering. Period. So, you know, partly when you're saying, well, can you regulate the collapse of these macro systems? You're saying, well, can you eliminate risk? Well, no, you can't. I don't think. In fact, you could argue I shouldn't say that exactly. I think there is one way that you can minimize risk. Don't be crooked. The less crooked your society is, the more you mitigate risk, but you can't eliminate it.